I have some numbers that I'd like to discuss. As of today, I'm looking at 26.6 million cases of COVID-19 with at least 451,000 deaths. Globally, we're looking at 105 million cases and 2.27 million deaths. How are you observing these numbers? We are hearing that experts are predicting a downward trend right now. Do these numbers kind of showcase that?
Well, I mean, first thing you have to acknowledge is that these numbers are real. I think the last time we spoke, we were a little less than 100 million cases, and our deaths weren't this high. The U.S. is pretty much totaling about 20% of the entire world's, total death that have occurred, and they account for about 26% of the total cases in the world as well. So we have to look at that from the scope of that's obviously not a good thing. But what we've seen is that, like you've mentioned, there's been a downward trend in a lot of these cases. Since the first time in November, the U.S. has averaged less than 150,000 cases per day. As for the last 2 weeks or so, we have had about 114,000 cases per day, which is, like I said, a 30% decrease from about 2 weeks ago. So we're headed in the right direction, I think.
Right. When we're looking at this, we are seeing surge in parts of the nation, Dr. Kataria, especially in a state like California, where they just have number of cases and the hospitalization are to the max. What is the reason behind this ongoing, surge? And we're also hearing that young adults from 20 to 46 could be responsible for this. What is your comment on that?
I think this is probably multifactorial. It kind of stems from a lot of the things that we were talking about the last time I was here. The holidays were upcoming, so people got together with their families and some of their loved ones and friends in the setting of COVID fatigue. And then you put on top of that, this is when the vaccine rollout started happening about in December time. So there was probably a false sense of security that, hey, the vaccine's coming out. I should be a little bit safe, when people in reality weren't taking into consideration that, it's going to take some time for this vaccine to take effect. And then there's other more kind of federal government type of issues, such as lack of mandating masks and the social distancing and having the subtle reopenings of certain venues and things like that. There were weddings going on and other events that, people were trying to reach some sort of normalcy and trying to balance that with the safety precautions. So all those things probably contributed significantly to those surges.
What's your biggest advice to these hotspot states right now that may be implementing a mask mandate, that have, stay-at-home orders going on? What else should they do?
I think that when we've seen certain other countries like New Zealand that have pretty much reduced their cases to nothing, they have evoked statewide, countrywide lockdowns. UK is actually on their third lockdown now, so I think that kind of further perpetuating the things that we've always been doing, the social distancing, wearing the mask, and then now getting people vaccinated that are applicable in those particular demographic and age groups. And then if we need to do another lockdown, that could be something that they will have to consider down the line, but we're hoping that's not what we end up having to do with the vaccine being rolled out.
Right. I'd like to now ask you about the COVID variants that is concerning experts all across. How many are you concerned about in the United States? And there is a news that's come out that the UK COVID variant could potentially be more deadly. How are you looking at these variants right now?
So, from the beginning of this whole process, we've been tracking the virus, and we know that it's gone through a lot of changes. And in particular, there have been 3 variants that have become of interest as per the World Health Organization. The UK one you're talking about, it's called B117. And then there's one from Brazil that's called the P1. And then there's one in South Africa that's called the B1351. And the reason why these are concerned, because there have been associations that these variants are associated with the increased number of cases in these particular countries. And, the scientists that have studied these variants, they have found that the variants tend to spread faster, they're a bit more transmissible, and they appear to be more infectious. So that's kind of the worrying part. The director of CDC, Rochelle Walensky, she was on NBC recently. She basically said that, we know that some of the variants have increased transmissibility, and there's increasing data that some of the variants, particularly the B117, which is the UK variant, may actually increase mortality. So we have to look at these things with a grain of salt, and then we have to look at them from a long scope. We don't have enough data to kind of tell us what that exactly means.
Right.
We don't necessarily know if they're exactly more lethal. We just know that they're much more transmissible. We don't know if they increase the severity of disease. Of interest, Denmark is, they had this whole massive virus sequencing of effort that they did, and they were able to isolate that the UK variant is starting to become the more predominant strain, and by March it should probably even peak, at least in the United States. The scientists in Denmark, they found that about 1.5 times, that's how much more infectious it could be. And, we started to see these variants in America, Colorado, Alaska, California, and Florida. Those are all places that have had this.
Right. We're also hearing news on these variants that they could potentially reinfect people who have had COVID-19. Have you seen that so far, or what are you hearing about that?
When the UK variant came out, there's researchers from the UK of Biobank, I believe it's called. They found that people that were infected with COVID-19, they end up keeping their antibodies for about 3 to 6 months. And however, if you come in contact with another strain of the virus, such as the ones that have been highly contagious in UK, we don't necessarily know if these antibodies that have been made to the initial strain are protective against the new strain. In theory, they should be, because that's kind of the premise that we've been using when the vaccine has started becoming, was rolled out. And then when the variant started coming out, people were like, hey, is the vaccine going to work? So in theory, it should work. But we do know that people can be reinfected.
Right. Let's talk about vaccines, because there's a lot of concern and questions about what's happening. My first question to you has to be, how have you felt about the slow speed of vaccine rollout? We were expecting to see 100 million vaccinations done in the first 100 days of the Biden administration. I'm a little concerned that they may not be able to meet that goal. How are you looking at it? What's the reason behind such a slow speed?
We would have to have an entire talk about just this one topic. But the common things are things that I think a lot of people have already thought about. It's supply and distribution. When the previous administration was here, they didn't really put into effect true infrastructure. It's okay to say, hey, the FDA has approved the emergency vaccine. The CDC has made their recommendations. Now we have these vaccines by these biopharmaceutical companies that are making them. And here, give them to these states. The states don't have an infrastructure to get it from the government, store them, deliver them to whatever locations, whether it's doctors' offices or pharmacies or hospitals or other, certain like food shopping areas have been able to give vaccines. So the whole infrastructure, how to deliver them from getting it to the destination, hasn't really been put into place. So that's a big issue. The other idea is back to the supply and distribution thing. Many states can't even get their hands on enough vaccines, and they have to forcing them to cancel tens of thousands of planned shots. There's, by the time you're told that, hey, you're going to get this much vaccine, you schedule whatever 5,000 appointments, 10,000 appointments in that district. And then by the time those appointments come around, you don't have necessarily that amount of vaccines. So, that's a big issue. And that kind of puts everybody further back. And, you have to take these vaccines within a certain time frame, because that's what the science shows. That's how it works. So if all that stuff gets pushed back, this kind of complicates a lot of the distribution process.
What do you suppose that the federal government should be doing right now to speed it up? Especially, how do they sort of make a plan that goes with the states and the federal government hand in hand?
So I think the first thing we have to do is we have to understand that this is the largest and the most expensive immunization effort that we've pretty much seen, So it's a pretty complicated system, and there's going to be lots of problems and lots of hiccups along the way. But we do know that from previous vaccination efforts, when it came to the Ebola and influenza, like H1N1, measles, and all those kinds of things in the past, that there needs to be clear federal leadership, guidance, and coordination and oversight of the things like the vaccine distribution, and those things are just starting to happen now. When President Biden got elected, the next day there was a federal response plan for the COVID response team. funding is another big issue. The federal government needs to invest more in that infrastructure that I'm talking about. People don't have jobs. Could they take the people that are unemployed now and employ them by making them a part of this team? And that, in one way, would help with some of the employment issues, and that would also help with the distribution issues. We need people to go out there and give vaccines. It's not easy to give. The projected number is 2 million vaccines a day. That's what they want to do. I mean, how many people do you think you need to achieve something like that? So that's another issue. And one of the more compelling ones is the accurate projections. Places have to know how many vaccines that they're getting. And if they don't get the amount that they were told, it makes their scheduling a little bit difficult as well. So open line of communication between the people distributing the vaccine and the people delivering the vaccine to patients.
Right. I hope they listen to all of the advice the medical doctors are giving us across the nation to really standardize this process, because we need these vaccines out. Have you been vaccinated yet?
I have. So I got vaccinated in the beginning of January. I had the Pfizer vaccine. I had no choice. I didn't have any say in which one I wanted. I personally didn't mind which one I got because I put my faith in science, and if science said that both of these vaccines were safe, I was okay getting whichever one. But I had in particular gotten the Pfizer vaccine. A lot of people, had concerns about, if the vaccine was tainted or something along those lines. From my personal experience, I didn't feel anything that was out of the ordinary. Everything that I experienced, I expected. I had just soreness on the arm that I injected. That lasted about 24 hours. I would say it's a little bit worse than what the flu vaccine was, but nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that was intolerable. Certain colleagues and other friends of mine that have gotten it, they got the Pfizer and they got the Moderna vaccine, depending on which one you ask. Some of them got flu-like symptoms, muscle aches, fatigue, but nothing that was alarming, nothing that they needed urgent attention and things like that.
You were in New York City when we were the epicenter, and you saw a lot as a medical professional. When you got your vaccine, how did that moment feel for you and also your colleagues? How does it feel when you get it as a frontline worker?
That's a good question. So when we first started speaking, I remember telling you that this is like a big part of history to be a part of something like this. You think about the AIDS pandemic, you think about polio, you think about influenza and the Spanish flu. Those are like big historic moments. And then the minute vaccines came out that eradicated measles, that eradicated polio, the Spanish flu and all those things, it was a big moment. And when I sat there getting that vaccine, I remember thinking to myself, had I not been in med school, had I not been a physician, would I have been able to have the same level of appreciation as I do now for the scientific community? A lot of times for me prior to that, I was just a guy reading things in a book and then, using those things to treat my patients. Now I was, for the first time, a true patient, and science was there to help me so I can further help other people. And it was like a very revelating moment for me. So I felt very proud of myself and proud of my scientific fellow community for being able to create a moment like this for so many of us, whether you're a physician, whether you're just a regular person or teachers, whoever it is. It's a great time to be alive, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And so much, gratitude to all of these people that have been working so hard and fighting the disease, at least at the front line. I have a couple more questions about vaccine here. I know you said that the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine necessarily don't have much difference, but today we're hearing that there is a study that's happening to see if different doses of the vaccines could be used to give the 2 doses to an individual, which means, first dose could be Moderna, the second dose could be Pfizer. How does it make sense to you? Is it possible?
Well, in theory, a lot of this stuff is possible because they're kind of a similar backbone, the mRNA type of approach that they're using to deliver the vaccine. But everything in science is a scientific method. You have an idea, you create an experiment, and then you observe the results, and that's it. You can't extrapolate data just off the top of your head. That's not kind of the way science works. You have to use the scientific method. So in theory, yes, things could work, but we don't know what could be the cross effects if you get a Pfizer vaccine and then you get a Moderna vaccine. We don't know what that looks like because we don't have the data. So I think most scientists will tell you that it's probably not the wisest choice, but in theory it could work. But what the data shows is what we have, and that's probably the best way to go about it.
And also, do you think when you're looking at doses, should doses be put on site for the second dose of a person? We're also hearing this news that some experts are saying to just give out as many first doses as possible. What is your take on that?
So yes, I did come across that information, and what the theory behind that was the first dose of the vaccine provides something along the lines of 75 to 80% protection. Right. And then the second dose would further boost your immunity to get you to that 95, 96% that the trials had shown. So yes, in theory that works. Is it better to have 80% of the entire population be protected 80%, or wait till we can get everybody to 90%?
More questions on vaccine here. AstraZeneca is saying that its vaccine appears to reduce transmission of coronavirus. They say one dose can protect up to 3 months. I know AstraZeneca has not been used in the US right now, but it's being used in different parts of the world. What insight could you give us about this?
So this was the first vaccine that looked at the potential of the virus to be transmitted. And it actually showed that the virus had slower transmission when given this vaccine. Dr. Fauci had made some comments about this, that if in fact that this is true, that's very encouraging. But we don't know what that long-term data looks like. We don't have it on a larger scale. So it's really difficult to extrapolate that data and say this is what's going to work. I think that they need to do certainly a lot more investigation into this. And if it does, then it really changes the game. And that kind of puts us in a much better light.
Yeah, also another thing that could change the game, Johnson & Johnson could be given an emergency use authorization maybe this week or next week. Their dose is just one dose. Do you see that speeding up the vaccination process? How do you look at that?
I think it's easier to give people a dose one time than it is to give multiple times, because you have to get a lot more quantity. You have to do the scheduling, and people have to be able to get to you. Because think about it, a lot of the people that aren't getting vaccines, they live in rural areas. I live in Pennsylvania right now. So for certain people from parts of Pennsylvania to get to a site that's being given the vaccine, it's hard for them, So if you can get that to a point where you only have to get one shot, that will certainly create some improvement in that distribution process.
Right. More on vaccination. Today we heard from CDC Director Dr. Walensky that schools can open safely even though the teachers don't have to be vaccinated. How are you looking at this? Teachers are concerned all across because, they are adults. They can get COVID-19. It could be transmitted in the school. We are hearing that children have not caused a huge, spread of the disease. But I'd like to know, a lot of students have been in virtual setting since last year. So do they have enough data to say that, you can open the school without the teachers getting vaccinated?
That's a tough question to answer because, like I said, there hasn't been a lot of studies on this. Right. If you remember when Wisconsin a couple of months ago had opened up their schools, they had 191 cases of students that got infected, but only 7 of those cases were sort of linked to teachers getting affected. I'm not sure how they came across these results, but they backtracked and did some things to figure out that the two weren't related. So does this mean that teachers can go back safely and then potentially get the virus and then take it home to some of their family members? We don't know that yet, but in theory, they probably could, right? Because if you can get infected, you can give it to anybody else. And I certainly resonate with the concerns that they have. They have families of their own, and they're risking their life to go to work to educate other people's families, and they're taking a significant risk. So I certainly understand their concerns. I just don't know what the right approach to this would be, because you're not going to be able to convince all these teachers to go back to school and risk themselves without some type of reassurance.
And even there are parents that don't want to send their kids back to school for the same reason. They just don't know what is going to happen in that building. I just have a couple more questions left for you here, Dr. Kataria. How are you looking at high-risk South Asians right now? People that have diabetes, heart diseases, lung issues. Are you concerned with these new variants and the lack of speed of vaccine affecting them?
I think that the same knowledge that we have about the disease is that the people that are at higher risk with the conditions that you mentioned are certainly going to remain at high risk until they obtain the vaccine, So the people still need to put themselves in positions that are protecting themselves, continuing to do all the social distancing and masks that we've already been doing. So I think that we have to have these people sign up and get their vaccines at the right time that they, are able to access them. And at least in my own community where I'm from in New Jersey, a lot of my family members have been having difficulty doing this, and a lot of them do suffer from these comorbidities, and they certainly do have a lot of fears.
Right. So would you say it puts them at a risk of getting COVID a lot more than other people because they have these comorbidities? Great.
Yeah.
My next question to you, and I just have two more questions left here for you. Restaurants in New York City, which was once the epicenter, will open indoor dining, which was banned for a while, on February 14th. Our neighboring state, New Jersey, has raised its capacity of indoor dining from 25% to 35%. I understand the economic, issues behind it and how important it is for us to help these businesses stay afloat. But do you think it's safe at this point for them to open indoor dining? Should people be going there?
So this is a tough question, because a part of me wants to say that, we should still stay closed and, ride this vaccine wave until we achieve the desired effects and attain that herd immunity. And for those that don't know, herd immunity, it varies from disease to disease. For you to achieve herd immunity, a certain percent of the population needs to be vaccinated. For measles, it was 95%. For polio, it was 80%. The studies for COVID showed that only about 60 to 70% people need to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. So I understand it from that perspective, where, a lot of people are getting this fatigue and they want to start going out. And if we can achieve this and slowly start reopening, then it might be the safer way to go. But then on the other hand, I started to think about the businesses and the families that are suffering and struggling to put food on the table and pay rent and afford the normal daily necessities. And I think there has to be a delicate balance between the safety and some form of normalcy at this point. And I think that when things do open up again, people should be extra cautious. And when in public, even when there's a sense of, we're close to this herd immunity, because all it takes is one slip up and you can have a sudden surge in cases, and that can start to spread like wildfire as well. So it's very possible that New York can once again become an epicenter.
Just to follow up, I would love to ask a doctor this. When do you, just yourself, personal opinion, predict us to get to some sense of normalcy in this country?
See, you phrased that question very particularly. You said this country. So because we live in a world that has many countries, and if you look at a lot of the data, it shows that UK has bought enough vaccines to vaccinate their entire population 2 times.
Wow.
United States has purchased enough vaccine to vaccinate their entire population 4 times. Canada has done it 6 times. There's about 84 countries in the world that don't even have 1 dose of vaccine. And the studies project that those countries might not get fully vaccinated until 2024. So that puts into perspective the state that we are in. People are rightfully selfish in the sense that they want to protect their own people, the government officials and stuff. So I don't know if we get to that point at the end of the year. Sure, United States might be well off, but that doesn't mean that other parts of the world that are not fully vaccinated, you can have a case or 2 that keeps coming in, and that really prevents us from getting to a point where we're fully eradicated this thing. Yeah. So that's difficult to answer, only because yes, can the United States or UK or some of these mega $1-trillion countries do it? Sure, they can. But this is a point in our human history where the rich really need to help out the poor. Because by the rich doing that, they're helping themselves. They've already estimated that this year alone, the United States is going to lose $9 trillion because of this illness. $9 trillion. I don't even know how big of a number. It's hard to fathom something like that. But just this year alone, that was the estimate. Just because of all the businesses and all that kind of stuff. So, we have to get to a point where we help everybody.
Yeah, that's so true. We need a lot of the country vaccinated for us to go back to any sense of normalcy, and I hope everybody goes and gets vaccinated. Thank you for your time here. My last question to you is just, what's your biggest concern right now as a doctor, and any advice you'd like to give us?
My concerns, I try to keep them pretty constant, and I think it's people getting to a point where they start to see like, we're making progress, so I can let my guard down a little bit. I was actually in my practice today and had a patient come in to do a test, and he refused to wear a mask. And I asked him, "Sir, can you put on your mask?" And he's like, "Why? Everybody's getting vaccinated. Do I still need it?" I'm like, "Is that the way you're thinking?" You know? So that's my fear. That's just one person. Luckily, it's just been one person since the vaccine came out that I came across. But I'm sure there's a lot of people like that all across the country and all across the world. And that's a fear of mine, that when you think you're safe, that's when you let your guard down, and then, we're back to where we started.